This is a Warren Steibel production in association with SICA. Funding for this Firing Line special debate is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the John M. Olin Foundation, the Annenberg Foundation, the Laurel Foundation, and L. John Polite, Jr.
Good evening. I'm Alex Sanders, currently the Chief Judge of the South Carolina Court of Appeals, soon to become the President of the College of Charleston at Charleston, South Carolina. The College of Charleston, most recently renamed the University of Charleston, is among the very last bastions of the classic liberal arts education. I'm your moderator for these special election editions of Firing Line. When I was a child growing up in South Carolina, all politically active black people were Republicans, proud members of the party of Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator. At least such black people who were allowed to vote were members of the Republican Party. This was, of course, not very many. Black people were not given full access to the ballot in the South until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Only then did they begin to vote in South Carolina in significant numbers. The Voting Rights Act, along with the other civil rights legislation of the 1960s, was the product of the Democratic administrations of Kennedy and Johnson. Unsurprisingly, newly enfranchised black people in the South joined their brothers and sisters in the North to vote Democratic in overwhelming numbers. They have continued to vote Democratic ever since. Our query this evening is whether black people should return to the party of Lincoln, or should they remain loyal to the party of slaveholders like Jefferson and Jackson? Should black people, African Americans as they say, vote Democratic in 1992? That is our query. Our panelists are, in a word, different. William Buckley, as everyone knows, this is his program, and we are all here by his leave. His unexcelled ability to articulate a position on a given issue is at times utterly exasperating. He is dangerously persuasive. I and countless others often agree with what he says, but we disagree with his right to say it. George McGovern, United States Senator, candidate for president, perhaps the last old-fashioned liberal to run for president. The nefarious effort to subvert his campaign resulted in the nation's greatest political scandal and brought about the resignation from office of Richard Milhouse Nixon. Some people have been so bold to suggest that Senator McGovern triumphed in the last. He, however, is not one of those people. Like Mr. Buckley and Senator McGovern, our special guests this evening are of diametrically opposed political persuasions. One is a Democrat, the other is a Republican. Unlike Mr. Buckley and Senator McGovern, however, both of them are black. For more than 20 years, Jim Clyburn has been an important figure on the South Carolina political scene. In early 1971, he joined the staff of Governor John West, where he played an important role in guiding South Carolina through times of racial turbulence. Since 1974, he has served South Carolina as its Commissioner of Human Affairs. He is reputed to be a Democrat. Armstrong Williams is a native of South Carolina as well, but he is now Chief Operating Officer of Grimm Williams Group, a public relations firm headquartered in Washington, D.C. The firm's clients include the real estate company of Century 21 and talk show host Oprah Winfrey. He has worked on the staffs of Senator Strom Thurmond, Congressman Floyd Spence, and Governor Carroll Campbell when Governor Campbell was a congressman. Mr. Williams is what was once the most endangered of species, at least the most endangered left unprotected by statute. He is a black Republican. We'll begin tonight with Mr. Buckley, and I suppose his answer to the question of should blacks vote Democratic will be a short one. Blacks should not vote Democratic because no one should vote Democratic, right, Mr. Buckley?
Well, that's pretty close, Your Honor. I'd like to ask Mr. Clyburn, whom I'm very glad to see again,
Thank you. Good to see you.
Well, it has ever occurred to him, as it may occur to some, that to the extent that you have this unanimity, which you have had in the recent past, in black reliance on the Democratic Party, which is the statist party, that there might be some overhang there of a plantation mentality, i.e. that you require the government to see you through life, as 150 years ago you required other people to see you through life. Has that ever occurred to you as something to worry about?
No, absolutely not. I look at that event, or those events, the way I look at what got us in the position we're in the first place. I find it very hard to figure out how you will apply an individual remedy to a harm that was heaped upon a group. Now, if the group was the recipient of the harm, then it seems to me that it's the group that needs to find the remedy, and the remedy must apply to the group. And so I don't see it as being plantation-oriented at all. I see it as a part of an effort on the part of black people to move out of the quagmire that it's currently in as a group rather than through individual remedies.
But don't you see, Mr. Clyburn, in the Republican Party, the party that is most enthusiastic about keeping alive those processes of upward mobility which have served an awful lot of people who came to America as bereft as the blacks were after the 13th Amendment was passed? And under the circumstances, isn't it risky not to take advantage of a mechanism that you have seen to be historically successful?
Oh, there's absolutely nothing wrong with black people as individuals taking advantage of any individual remedy that may come from the Republican Party or the Democratic Party for that matter. But that is not to say that we ought to exclude ourselves from the activity of the party that best addresses the problems we have or the harm that's being heaped upon the group. And so it seems to me that it's a Democratic Party that has, as the judge said during his introduction, that has come forward with those group remedies, such as the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act is not individually applied. It's applied to the group because it was the group that was denied the right to vote. And so these group remedies that we tend to heap upon black people as plantation-oriented, to me seems to beg the question quite a bit.
Well, let me, if I may, let me take this a step further and I address both of you gentlemen, since you all had the answers during the 60s and we all realize that they have failed. As an African-American, not as a Republican, but as an African-American, I think that anybody can see that the welfare system, that the New Deal put in place, even the president at the time said, I pray to God that it doesn't become an opium to the society. I think it's a tragedy that the welfare system has been put in place to the extent that it still exists. Because I tell you, it's the worst form of slavery. What you do is you enslave people's minds. You give them no hope. They don't believe in themselves. It's a paternalistic mentality. And what you do, you destroy the school systems around the country. You create people who resent the establishment and who try to teach them values in the school. They're brought up in single-parent homes, because I have been told stories by African Americans who are Democrats who said to me privately, look, I hate the system. I don't know what to do. I remember during the 70s when I was coming along, in order for me to qualify for AFDC, I could not have a man in the house. What the government would do was send a social worker around and look into my bed, look in my closet, and if a man was in my house, I would not qualify. This broke the black family up. Then we asked the question why so many kids are being reared today by single parents, single mothers. It's because that welfare system has destroyed it. Now, I am not so much interested in political platitudes as Mr. Clyburn just presented, because I do know he is a candidate for office in this great state. I am more interested in solutions to the ills that are devastating the society today. How do you respond to that,
Well,
Senator?
Mr. Williams, first of all, let me say I think you're pretty good on the platitudes. I think you've handled yourself very well. The assumption
we specialize in the best.
the assumption, for example, that the 60s are a total failure as far as black people are concerned, I find a very strange notion. Obviously, the 1960s didn't achieve everything that one might have hoped for, but it did achieve the Voting Rights Act. It did achieve the civil rights legislation of that period, which was historic. And I find it very difficult to dismiss that as though it wasn't an important part of the leadership of this country. And it came from the leadership of Kennedy and Johnson in that period. Now, as far as welfare is concerned, probably the most important, if we're going to talk about the welfare state, I don't think we have such in the United States, but to whatever extent we do, the cornerstone of that is the Social Security system. That's the major means by which we assist people in this country. We do it through old age payments to people after 65. We do it through Medicare. We do it through the special programs for the handicapped. That's the one program that even Ronald Reagan said he wouldn't touch. He thought it was the most important single program. He said, I'm willing to compromise on anything else, but not Social Security. Let me just finish my point. But when Social Security was proposed in the 1930s, conservatives such as yourself opposed it, predicted it would lead to all kinds of statism and regimentation. I don't know what's wrong with that program or school lunches or rural electrification.
I thought we didn't have a welfare state.
Yeah,
I'm not saying we do have a
here?
welfare state, but these are important programs that have lifted the quality of life for whites and blacks.
Let me say this to you. I don't think anybody who's a thinking American has a problem with senior citizens and the handicaps benefiting from their system.
Well,
but what about those young men and women who are able to work, who are capable of working, that you tell them when they go home in the evening and they see their mother only receiving a check and not working for it, why should they study hard?
I think Governor Clinton is
But how do you deal with that?
Well, I think
Please address that
Governor
for us.
Clinton's made some good proposals on that.
What
that we
proposals?
have to strengthen
Workfare.
the job
Workfare.
opportunities. Yes, and I don't see anything wrong with that. I think that...
I don't know. Reagan came up with it 25 years ago.
But I don't see the evidence that the Republican leadership we've had the last 11 years has provided any more jobs for people. What we've had in the Mr. Buckley talks about upward mobility. Everybody's for upward mobility, but we haven't had much of that the last 11 years. What we've had is an enormous transfer of wealth from the middle class to the highest income people in the country. You know that's a fact.
That's upward mobility.
The upward mobility is to take it away from the middle class and to give it to the people at the top.
Upward mobility doesn't have to start at the bottom, Senator.
Assuming that everybody is now in favor of welfare reform, and so that is not really a partisan issue anymore. Back to the partisan aspects of our discussion, I just start with Mr. Buckley again. Suppose someone were to be so rude as to suggest that the plantation model is appropriate by way of comparison to the Democratic Party, except blacks now own the plantation.
Well, that would not greatly distress my point. My point being that what one wants to encourage in the black community is that self-care, that individuality, that sense of pluralism, which is inconsistent with bloc movements in behalf of any single party. There's no reason I can see why there should be less division among blacks than there is among
Well, do you seriously
whites
suggest
in
black
respect
people
about it.
vote in a bloc any more than
Yes,
white people of same interests vote?
Yeah, I do.
I think in order for African Americans to have true power in this country and to celebrate a diversity, I think they need to become a majority in both parties. And I think they have a long way to go before they become a majority in the Republican Party. And I don't think there's no better time than the present to start that process. I think it's sad. I think what has happened, that the African American community and the Democratic politicians are in a perpetual relationship where one is the benefactor and the other is the beneficiary. I think that's what it is. And I think it's very sad if you think that the government should hand out a check to someone who doesn't work for it, and then you fleece those who create power in this country to cover the overdraft.
Well, we got some strange hang-up about this check business, but explain to me what you're talking about. How can the black people in this country ever become a majority in either party? I mean, the numbers aren't there. What are you talking about?
A majority in terms of the percentages in the African American community.
You mean the majority of black people being active in
Both
one of the
parties.
parties or the other?
Right.
Well, how can the majority of black people be active in both parties? I mean, that is an impossibility.
It is not an impossibility. You would like to
You
think
got to
that it's
either
an
be a
impossibility.
majority. You know, if you've got 100 black people, 51 would be a majority. Now they're going to be in one party or the other. The 51
I
can't be in
think
both
what
parties.
I'm advocating, and you can try to twist it as much as
I'm
you
not
like.
trying to twist it. I'm trying to understand what you're
You're trying
saying.
to twist it, and you understand what I'm saying. What I'm saying
I don't.
is that we need a majority in both parties.
I'd like to make the point.
That's impossible.
I
Go
don't
ahead.
see on the record where the Republicans have done anything in the last 11 years to justify the black vote. The job opportunities have gone down.
Are you so inquisitive on the subject that you want to ask me?
Well, I'd like to just make a point and then throw it to you, Mr. Buckley, that we know that less has been done for blacks. We know there's been a weakening of affirmative action. We know there's been fewer job opportunities, less support for housing, nothing for the cities. The cities have just been written off by the Reagan-Bush leadership. President Bush is the first president since the Civil War to veto a civil rights bill. Why would any thoughtful black vote Republican in 1992?
Well, shall we count the ways in which the black community prospered during the 80s? Number one, interest was reduced from 13% to approximately 7%. Unemployment was reduced from 10.5% to about 4%. The highest number of Americans were employed, including blacks, in the history of the country. There was a greater ascendancy in the black middle class of any other time before, and there were 90 straight months of economic prosperity. Have I bored you?
Well, why is it that in the last Newsweek poll, 51% of the blacks say they're worse off today than they were 10 years ago? If all of these wonderful things have happened, why isn't that perceived?
Well, because
by the black vote?
10 years ago they had Reagan as president.
Well, explain to me how did we go from the 60s all the way up to the 80s, closing the income gap between blacks and whites? Now, nobody argues with that. We all admit that took place. And from the 80s to 92, we have begun to widen the income gap between blacks and whites. So there's something wrong with that argument.
No, Mr. Clyburn, that's in part true, but it depends on the numbers that you, if you take the median, you're correct. Sure. However, there have been a substantial increase in the ascendancy of blacks into the middle class, which is the objective. What we do have is a hang-up with the lowered 11 to 13% of blacks and whites, and Mr. Williams has an idea of why that happened, and I agree with him. The big problem is illegitimacy. How are you going to blame that on the Republican Party?
Infant mortality.
I don't blame illegitimacy on the Republican Party, not as it relates to reproduction. But I do blame a lot of other illegitimate concepts on the Republican Party, because I think the whole notion that you are going to apply individual remedies.
Individual what?
Individual remedies to the harm that's been heaped upon black people as a race of people, to me, is an illegitimate notion.
Judge, you said
it can't happen.
You said at the beginning that Mr. Buckley would probably say blacks should vote Republican for the same reason that whites should. I would say that in reverse. I don't see any reason why.
I anticipated that. I started to say that about you.
But the ordinary white person, just like the ordinary black person, has been left behind the last 10 years. The middle class is being crowded down. Their income is less, even with both parents working. The average family today is not doing as well as they were 30 years ago or 20 years ago. That's true.
I'm sorry, but I dispute that figure, which was disputed as recently as 3 weeks ago in The Economist, which says that if you count in the cash value of the transfers such as food stamps, education, medical care, has in fact been an increase, a net increase.
Those are all things the Democrats have done to try to deal with this situation. Those are the things you're against.
Well, but it may very well be that the emphasis by the Democratic Party on such as that has in fact caused those inhibitions in movement, which you began by deploring. We didn't have all those things I just finished enumerating 90 years ago. By current standards, 90% of the American people were poor at the turn of the century. Now, something happened to reduce that to 11%. It wasn't your food stamps that did it.
I agree with that.
It was a spirit of the
Expanding
American people
economy.
which this gentleman was trying to revive.
Yeah, it was
And I'm
expanding,
for it.
but how well is the economy doing today? How well is the
Well,
private economy answering?
Mr.
Well, we're in the
Buckley-
middle of a recession.
Mr.
Yeah.
The
Buckley
business
makes
cycle hasn't ended.
Yeah.
Mr. Buckley makes the point that the prime interest rate has declined during the 80s. You
That's
make
all.
the counterpoint that blacks appear nevertheless dissatisfied with the status of things. Apparently,
correct.
the poll didn't poll many blacks who were borrowing money at the prime interest rate. Perhaps that's the-
I think
What happened,
upper.
I think all of us have seen all of the studies. There have been national studies done, and when you come out with national studies that say that with all of these low interest rates, that shows that black people are turned down twice as often as white people in making applications for these low interest rate loans that you're talking about. Why are they being turned down? They're not being turned down on individual basis. They're being turned down the moment they walk through the door and the face is shown, they're turned down. Now, all the studies have indicated that all across the country. Now, how do you sit here and tell me that we've benefited from these low interest rates when we are not being allowed access to the marketplace in order to take advantage of those low interest rates? Sure, the interest rates have come down. But if you're being denied to twice as often as white people are being denied, then what's wrong?
Yeah. Let me address that. There's much merit to what you're saying.
There's no question about it.
Yeah, and I'm not going to argue with that. There are those people who make a judgment based on people by looking at the pigmentation of their skin, which is very ignorant. But much of it also has to do with economics. I mean, if you were to do the same study, you will find that there are a lot of poor whites who are turned out just as much. It has to do with economics. It's a fact. You just read the stats. But let me say this to you. What we have to get to, we have a lot of problems. The Democrats have done some things that are good. The Republicans have. But the problem now is what we need to do is empower people in the communities. People need to have a sense of ownership. Communities need to feel that they have some kind of control over the judicial system, over the police system in their communities. I mean, despite what the problems are, entrepreneurship, we need, Americans, particularly black Americans, need to feel that they can own something, that they own a piece of America. And more than any time ever, blacks are beginning to own homes in America. More blacks have gone into business between 1980 and 1992 than ever before in the history of this country. That is a fact. And whether you want to admit that or not, and the other thing that I think that a lot of Democrats do, and that I have a problem with, I think that a lot of blacks are taught by civil rights leaders and white liberals, particularly civil rights leaders, that they cannot trust whites, that whites are the enemies, and that whites can only be racist. That's not true. Blacks can be racist too. The fact of the matter is, many of us get caught up in skin color, but the fact of the matter is a white can be a role model for a black, and a black can be a role model for a white. We need to embrace each other as human beings. I think we do, and the same situation that happened in LA had a lot to do with hate. The verdict was a travesty, but when you teach kids hate, they feel they have no place to go, and it's sad that you do have systems in place where people are discriminated against because of the pigmentation of their skin.
Mr. Williams, let me ask you a question. You're talking about building a system that gives people a chance. What would you think if the President of the United States, working with the Congress, and Mr. Buckley, maybe you want to comment on this, would look at this Cold War military budget that we built to fight the Russians? Presumably that's not needed anymore. Let's say that half of it you keep for other potential enemies. What if you cut that military budget in half and diverted that carefully into programs to rebuild the whole physical infrastructure of the country? The streets, the roads, the bridges, the water systems, the sewage system, and put people back to work, whether they're white or black or brown or whatever. Wouldn't that be an important initiative that the President and the Congress could take? And I don't want to put it on a partisan basis. I think it's something that we ought to do on a bipartisan basis. What's wrong with that?
Well, there's nothing wrong with it, I'm sure, but I want to keep it on a partisan basis. That's what.
All right. Let's
and
this particular proposal, you're going to have bipartisan support.
I think we should say that there has never been a moment in modern history where Senator McGovern hasn't been in favor of trimming the military.
Except during World War II, the good war.
Except during World War II. His proposal in 1962 was laughed down by President Kennedy. I'm very grateful that he did so.
When was that?
The 20% that you proposed to cut in 1961, and it was defeated by the Senate overwhelmingly.
It's actually 2%,
under his leadership.
A 2% cut.
Well, the 20% cut that I read about must have been a typo.
Yeah, it was.
Well, the other cuts, you never denied. After all, in 1948, he was for Henry Wallace for president, who wanted to cut the whole thing.
No, he didn't.
About 100%.
No, Wallace never advocated cuts in defense.
He just volunteered surrendering to the Soviet Union. We
didn't advocate that either.
Well, our time is exhausted. Perhaps our panel is exhausted. I know that I am exhausted. We seems to have covered the waterfront about as well as it could be done in half of an hour. And since this is Mr. Buckley's program, he gets the last word. Mr. Buckley?
Well, let me say something which will play into your hands. All this business about acquiring the right to vote is, I think, historically of only minor interest, by which I mean that the vote is sometimes used, as Charles Sumner said, as a political means of self-aggrandizement, as distinct from an economic means of self-aggrandizement. If the purpose of a vote is for me to take money away from him, then my exercise of that vote is, I think, an abomination. And voting, I think, is most often encouraged as a means of redistribution, and it's for that reason that we ought to be a little bit more measured when we think of that as an epical victory. The ideal society does not use the vote for the purpose of affecting a redistribution which isn't sanctioned economically. Would you disagree with that, Senator?
Well, I don't think giving people the right to vote takes it away from anybody else. It simply broadens the franchise. I don't get the point of your question.
Well, my point is that the vote is more and more used as an instrument of redistribution. For instance, the vote came to women in Switzerland only, 6 years ago, and there's still a couple of cantons that don't have it. They don't particularly protest it because in Switzerland, the vote is not used for those purposes. It's not used for the purposes of taking from Jones in order to give to Johnson for political reasons. But in America, that temptation is supreme.
I think, Mr. Buckley, when you have a president who has no vision and no sense of direction in which the country should go, you get this kind of splitting up of the sense of purpose that's lacking right now in the United States. And you get people seeking their own interest and not looking at the larger picture.
Well, but the larger picture, I think,
Time's up.
Ought to reject utopia.
Time's up. That's Firing Line. I'm Alex Sanders. Thank you for being with us.
Next week on Firing Line, New York Congressman Stephen Solars, named one of the 24 worst offenders in the House bank scandal, talks to William F. Buckley, Jr. about the vulnerability of incumbents. Funding for this Firing Line special debate was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the John M. Olin Foundation, the Annenberg Foundation, the Laurel Foundation, and L. John Polite, Jr. For a printed bound transcript of this program, send $3 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina, 29250. Indicate the subject of the program and please allow 3 weeks for delivery.
This is PBS. William F. Buckley, Jr. offers 20 years of Firing Line guests from the 60s to the 80s. For $19.95, you can receive this companion book by sending a check or money order to Firing Line, 2700 Cypress Street, Columbia, South Carolina, 29205.